Welcome to Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having now about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm Eric Farnsworth, your series host. Conditions in Bolivia are deteriorating, both economically and politically. Ever since 2019, when the Bolivian people decisively rejected Evo Morales' extrajudicial effort to remain in power, a result subsequently verified by the Organization of American States and numerous international observers, Bolivia has been on a downward path. Institutions are weak and subject to political influence. To maintain authority and control, the current president, Luis Arce of Morales' MAS party, is increasingly targeting opposition members and broader civil liberties. The previous constitutional president, Janine Áñez, remains in prison without charges. Economically, the nation remains impoverished, highly indebted, and without immediate prospects for growth. The banking sector is in crisis. Protests are frequent. Nonetheless, Bolivia does maintain world-class deposits of natural gas and also lithium, a critical input for energy transition which the government has just agreed to work with China to develop. It's all a far cry from the days when Bolivia was being touted as a success story in South America. How did we get from there to where we are now? Our guest today is Jaime Aparicio, a former senior Bolivian diplomat, including ambassador to the United States and also to the OAS. Jaime has had extensive experience on democracy issues at the hemispheric level as head of the Inter-American Judicial Committee, among others. He has also played a leading role in working for the success of summits of the Americas and expanded regional trade and investment. He is now a strategic corporate consultant and advisor. Jaime Aparicio, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
Let's start with an easy question. What's the state of democracy in Bolivia today?
Well, Bolivia is facing a double crisis at this moment. One is a political crisis that has to do with democracy and the lack of democracy, I would say. And on the other side, an economic crisis that will presumably collapse the economy of Bolivia because of the fiscal deficit and the situation of Bolivian reserves. In terms of democracy, I think that Bolivia is in the transit of being a illiberal democracy like Argentina or Mexico, and it's increasingly becoming a dictatorship. Unfortunately, the rule of law and the essential elements of democracy as pointed in the Inter-American Democratic Charter are not respected. There is an internal fight in the movement towards socialism, the MAS, the party of Evo Morales and Arce, and they are fighting to prove their constituencies who is more radical. So that's why Luis Arce has started using the justice system in order to persecute all the adversaries or the opponents, the political opponents. Now we have in Bolivia more than 200 political prisoners, including the former president, including the current governor of Santa Cruz, who was democratically elected. He was basically kidnapped, put in a high security jail without any proof or any legal ground. And we have also a former indigenous leader from Potosí, who was a candidate for the vice presidency. We have another leader of the legal coca growers who is in jail, who was tortured. And we have a situation in which we could say that Bolivia has no longer respect for rule of law, and we are on the way of becoming a new Nicaragua. The situation is very similar to Nicaragua. On the economic front, the crisis is even worse because Bolivia, as the Grupo de Puebla was proclaiming was the economic miracle of Bolivia.
The Grupo de Puebla is
all these left-wing populist governments in Latin America who work together, starting by Cuba, now Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, of course, is very important in that group. And they are also people from Podemos in Spain. It's a very organized group, very well-financed, who is fighting against, democratic governments in Latin America, including Luis Almagro, the OAS, and they have a very clear political and ideological agenda. But I was saying that on the economic front, Bolivia is facing an enormous crisis. As you know, when Evo Morales arrived to power, Bolivia, the previous liberal governments have invested a lot of money in a system called the capitalization, which consists in signing contracts of risk prospection contracts with foreign companies. No? That's the reason why Bolivia became the largest supplier of gas in the Americas after Venezuela. So when Morales arrived, the dollar was $40 per barrel. It went to 80, and then it went to $200 the barrel. So if you add mineral and grains and gas, Bolivia received during Morales and Arce around $55 billion. That's 6 times the Bolivian revenue in the past. The GDP of the past was multiplied by 6. So the question is what they did with this money. And this money was dilapidated in big projects, corruption, white elephants, as we say in Spanish, corruption, vanity projects. He built a huge palace of government that was named like the Ceausescu Palace, the palace of the people, the house of the people. He did a museum for himself, Evo Morales. Very expensive. There was no investments in hospitals or education or infrastructure. So we lived out of this boom of this super cycle of raw materials, and it was the old model of exporting primary goods. Until the boom was over and we started to pay the bill. Bolivia had 10 years of continuous fiscal deficit, until we arrived today to have the largest deficit in our history. We went from $15 billion of reserves to $3 billion. We have $3 million cash in the bank. They tried to sell bonds on the sovereign bonds in New York with the financial institutions. Last year, they had $2,000 billion to sell. It was only, the investors bought only 800, but were the Bolivian private pension funds that had to buy that because they were obliged by the government. They bought that. Now they were depreciated. These days, Fitch and Moody's reduced the rating of Bolivia to B- and C. And so the depreciation of these bonds affected the Bolivian pension funds, so they decided to nationalize now the pension funds. So the crisis is, Bolivia, I think, is going to have an economic collapse at any moment because they are subsidizing gas and hydrocarbons. That is around $220 million a month of subsidies. And the result is that unless they decide to use the pension funds, what would be a tragedy for the future of Bolivians, or use the gold reserves, because they are changing the law in order to use the gold as collateral, but they are going to keep the subsidies. So those two issues, democracy weakness and the economic crisis, are today the scene in which Bolivians are looking with no hope how the country is evolving to become another Venezuela or another Nicaragua.
If you listen to the Bolivian authorities, they say, well, we have a lot of lithium. The world needs lithium. We have just signed a huge development contract with China for a consortium to develop lithium deposits. It sounds like you're a little bit skeptical that that's going to lead to the promised economic boom that the government is claiming.
Well, I would say that's another tragedy. Bolivia has, according to the UNDP, around 23 million from 86 million of reserves in the world. Bolivia is the largest deposits of lithium. Then it comes Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. No? They didn't know what to do. First, they signed a contract with the Germans. Then they decide to unilaterally decide to break this contract with the Germans, and then the Mexicans were proposing to create a pool of states to run the lithium. Of course, Chile didn't accept that idea, and Argentina is looking on his own side, and Mexico decided to go alone.
Like a cartel is what you're suggesting.
Like a cartel of these countries. Yep. And now Bolivia, the president said that lithium is going to be 100% controlled by Bolivia. They are not going to give up the administration or the production on those conditions. It's very difficult to find the serious investors. But the Chinese are there. Of course, they sign an agreement. There's a total lack of transparency because nobody knows what are the conditions. They are going to exploit the lithium in the Coipasa and Uyuni salt flakes, and nobody knows the conditions or how this contract is going to operate. Many people suspect that they're going to ask, like Venezuela did, money in advance in order to cover these subsidies. But nobody knows what's happening. I think the UNDP study or the CSIS has said that the only one that is really developing the lithium is Chile at this point.
You know, this could be, though, a repeat of the cycle that's really touched Bolivia for 500, 600 years, no? I mean, mining, primary products, etc., but the wealth of the country doesn't go to the miners or the campesinos or people in the broader society, no? I mean, it sounds like this has the chance to repeat that Bolivian traditional development. So the idea that this is going to create massive jobs and create new wealth for the majority of Bolivians, we should probably be skeptical of that, no?
Absolutely, because it's still the old model, the model of the 60s of primary exports. No? So it was the gas. Bolivia has no longer gas. It's no gas to export because there was no prospection, there were no investments in new deposits. I think that for the last 14 years there was not a cent invested in prospection. So now we don't have gas. Argentina is going to buy now gas from Argentina, or Brazil from Argentina. So Bolivia has lost this cycle of high prices of gas exportations, and money was vanished. Nobody knows where it went, and we are worse than ever, and we're about to repeat the same cycle.
Yeah. I remember some years ago when Tuto Quiroga was president of Bolivia, he was talking about how Bolivian gas could actually supply the west coast of the United States. And so there were these big ambitions and these big ideas that simply didn't come to fruition because of the lack of investment that you're talking about. Let's shift gears we have to talk about the elephant in the room. You talked about white elephants, let's talk about another elephant. Yeah. Every time you talk about Bolivia in Washington or in La Paz or around the hemisphere, it ultimately comes back to the elections of 2019. When Evo Morales attempted to continue with his mandate through extrajudicial means. But I wonder how you see that in the context of the strength of Bolivian democracy. There was a chance to recapture the democratic momentum coming out of that, but it seems as if it has now degenerated into the type of circumstances you were earlier talking about. How are you viewing that inflection point in Bolivian history?
Well, that's right. What happened in Bolivia is that there was electoral fraud that had many, it was not a single issue that constituted fraud. The main issue was the contamination or the corruption of the technological system. It was penetrated by people that was not part of the electoral court.
Which the OAS confirmed.
But there were also all kind of violations of the electoral law. It was a multiple fraud. It was observed by the OAS. It was confirmed by the European Union, the Carter Center, and lately by the State Department, that because the Congress asked the State Department to do a review of the OAS report. And the State Department, after a year, has released this information saying that this OAS report was accurate and was technically perfect. So there was a fraud in Bolivia. But this is something that is happening in Latin America, unfortunately, the false narratives and the fake news and the things. So they constructed all these theories that there was no fraud. And it was not Bolivia, because we have to understand that what's happening now in Bolivia, like in Peru, has other actors. We sometimes give too much credit to Evo Morales. But you have the Cubans there, and you have the Argentinians and the Mexicans. The fraud. There was a Mexican company, very close to AMLO and to the government of Mexico, who came here to Bolivia a few days before and they prepare all this system that consists in a server that was outside the court and that was included in the tally system. So I think that also the Russians were very active in doing fake news the days previous to the election. So there was a whole machinery of fraud. And then they tried to convince people that there was no fraud. Mexico hired one of these companies in Washington, this Center for Economic Studies. You know that they were used to work for Venezuela and for all these governments. They released a report saying that there was no fraud, and they came with the story that MIT University has produced another report that was not true. I wrote to the dean of MIT. He answered me. He doesn't. He teaches here, but this report has nothing to do with the university. The same did with Spain, but it was all an orchestrated effort to create this false narrative of a coup d'etat. The reality is that Evo Morales resigned because the people during 19 days went to the streets and they were decided to get rid of him. They asked him to resign. Finally, he resigned and escaped to Mexico. And then the Catholic Church, the political parties, the Congress, who was controlled by Evo Morales people, the special envoy of United Nations, the special envoy of Spain, all these people meet and find a pacific solution, and that was to continue the legal, succession rules in the Congress. And since the president has resigned, the vice president, the president of the Senate, and the lower chamber, then the presidents came to the vice president of the Senate, who was Janine Áñez. She was even not in La Paz. She was not in those negotiations. She was in a department of Beni, close to Brazil. They sent her an airplane. She came here and she became president with the only mandate to call for new elections. And that's what happened. Everybody knows that. The European Union knows that, the OAS, the UN. But now you read and they continue talking about a coup d'etat that never existed. But that's how they operate. And the idea is that Morales doesn't want to look that he escaped.
Yeah.
And he was so scared, and he was not Allende and trying to, he was the first one in escaping the country. And now in this fight with Arce, he wants to show that he was really a victim of the thing, and Arce on his side wants to look more radical than him and put in prison everybody. So that's the political situation there.
It's important that we go through that because there's a lot of misinformation, as you indicate, around the events of 2019 and the constitutional process that brought the new president, Janine Áñez, to power and her mandate. And in fact, she ran the election, which now Arce is the beneficiary of and continues to move forward in terms of some of the actions that we've been talking about. I really want to thank you for coming here and joining us here at Democracy Dialogues, Jaime. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope you'll come back. We don't have enough time to really get into the topics that they deserve, but you've been very generous with your time. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues. Join us each month as we bring to you the most pressing issues on democracy in the Americas with the top advocates, analysts, and advisors. Together, we can work to ensure that democracy delivers for all. Until next month, for the Democracy Dialogues, this is Eric Farnsworth. Have a great day.